right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD, anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss. I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. And thank you all for joining me today for this typically question and answer based podcast. Today is not a question and answer based podcast, though. So typically, you can go over to fearcastpodcast.com and you can submit a question there by clicking on the, as you would have guessed, submit a question link. Send me a question about OCD and anxiety and support for someone with anxiety and how to do therapy, et cetera, et cetera. Send me any question you'd like. I will get it, read it, consider it, and likely put it up on a future episode. You can also do that over at Instagram. I am Fearcast Podcast over at the Instagrams, and one of the best ways to send a question these days is an audio question. Go over there and send me a direct message. Click on the little microphone, record it over there. It'll send directly over to me that way. You can also send me an audio, record it onto your phone, send it over either to questions at fearcastpodcast.com or share a link to a shared Google Drive from or at the fearcastpodcast.com. Submit a question link as previously mentioned. Anyhow, today is not going to be a question and answer based episode. Today is one of those episodes where I had the privilege of interviewing an expert on OCD to talk about a different way of approaching treatment. So today I had Rich Gallagher on. He's a licensed therapist, and he is the author of an article in the IOCDF newsletter that I will link to on the episode page. The article is called "Disgust-Based OCD: Thoughts on a New Treatment Protocol." So we're going to be talking about, as you could have guessed, treatment for disgust-based obsession. So we'll talk a little bit more about it in the episode, but kind of disgust-based is slightly different from what we've been talking about, what we typically would talk about in OCD land. In OCD land, we often talk about the obsession, like the obsessions, the feared story, right? What is your brain telling you about this thing that's going to happen? For some, there is no feared story. Well, for some, it is just, this thing feels gross. This thing makes me feel bad. I feel disgusted. And that's as far as it goes. Now, there are other elements that can complicate it, sure. But generally speaking, when it falls into a disgust-based obsession, typical exposure and response prevention treatment lacks, it fails, and it's frustrating for the clinician, frustrating for the individual. So Rich Gallagher put together a kind of a treatment protocol discussing the differences between ERP and what he which he calls a mastery model, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is a long episode. I apologize. Sorry, not sorry. It was a great conversation. Rich was so generous to talk about his approach. We also devolved a little bit into kind of the growing and shifting and changing of the treatment landscape and how research and growing interests and growing knowledge of treatment and the feedback from individuals experiencing OCD in its various flavors are influencing treatment itself. So we talked a lot a bit about just how the landscape is changing and how we are, how it's good, how it's frustrating, how it's exciting, how it's it's tough to try to accommodate and think about all these different approaches, but also how it's great that we can use all these different approaches to meet someone where they're at and to help someone where one approach may not be working for them as effectively as it could and as they would want. So we kind of go all over the place, so I appreciate your patience with it. This might be one where you break it up into a couple different listens. So, anyhow, a little bit about Rich Gallagher. So, Rich Gallagher is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's a graduate of the IOCDF's BTTI. It's the Behavior Therapy Training Institute. And he practices, he treats OCD and anxiety. He also works with workplace issues, career sociopaths, couples, and individuals. He's also a best-selling author, and he talks a little bit about his previous life in the engineering software world. So he'll talk a little bit about that and his transition into being a therapist. So without further ado, everybody, here is my conversation with Rich Gallagher. All right, thank you so much, Rich Gallagher, for joining us for the Fearcast today.
Hi, it's great to be with you, Kevin. I've been a big fan of your podcast, and it's nice to be your guest today.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you could join us. So I reached out to you. I read something about disgust-based OCD, kind of this theory, a little while ago, and then I came across your article in the IOCDF newsletter, read through that, and went, man, I've read this before. And then I thought, this would be something that needs to be talked about, addressed, and kind of gotten into the hands of people who may be struggling with disgust-based obsessions, or a therapist who's got a client who's struggling with disgust-based obsession and may need to hear a different way of doing this and hear permission on how to maybe step outside of the box to trying something new that may reach the ears of someone struggling with this and feeling like they're just not going to get better.
And I'm so glad you're disseminating these ideas, Kevin. Kind of the backstory behind this. Yeah. I've always used kind of a strength-based approach to ERP. I'm a BTTI graduate like you, and I'm, a hardcore CBT therapist, and I very much believe in the science. But I had a lot of clients who were very squeamish about traditional straight-down Broadway ERP. And so by focusing on their strengths in terms of how they could expand their comfort zone from week to week, I had really good outcomes. However, the real backstory behind this came not just from my clients, because I found some of my discussed cases were also very sticky, but for me personally. I have lived experience with OCD. I, for years, had very well-managed contamination OCD, which didn't yield particularly well to exposure. I've had it work well for other themes of mine, but not for that one. But as I approached retirement, I'm almost 70 now, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with a heart condition, put on a medication that plunged me into severe depression, and my previously well-managed OCD went through the roof. As I climbed out of that, traditional ERP left me traumatized and housebound. And, thankfully, I found a great ERP therapist who really knew her stuff about ERP, but also was open and flexible about trying to figure out what was going wrong here. We spent months jiggling the key in the lock, and I did a lot of searching in the literature, and we discovered two things. One is there's a growing body of research, especially over the last 10 years, that disgust does not respond the same way as fear does. And what I discovered is that by tweaking the exposure logic and learning to expose myself to avoided situations, which do habituate, versus the triggers, which for all practical purposes don't habituate quickly, that was game-changing in my own recovery. And so, in addition to my own recovery and my own client experiences, that was where the thought came in about proposing this as a treatment protocol. Ever since then, I have gotten a flood of feedback from people saying that this has been game-changing for them. Now suddenly their clients are leaving the house for the first time, shopping for the first time, doing things in public, and that this strategy has worked really well for them. We talked a little bit about this offline. It involves some things that go against the religion of traditional ERP, such as using safety behaviors and so forth. But I want to get into gory detail as to good and bad uses of the strategy and why it works so well for disgust.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing this in a little bit more detail. So why don't we start off with just like what would be. We've kind of talked about how disgust-based OCD treatment is going to be different than the traditional ERP CBT-based approach. I guess could you go over, let's say this is a new podcast for someone who hasn't really heard about this. Can you do like a brief overview of what ERP would be, and then how that would differ then from disgust-based?
Absolutely. And that's a great way to frame this, Kevin. Of course, ERP, for the people who aren't as familiar with it, you could summarize it as feel the fear and do it anyway, although it's a little more nuanced than that. To me, traditional habituation-based ERP revolves around the whole concept of an extinction burst, which I feel is a magic eraser for fears. In other words, the discovery that if you sit with a fear trigger long enough, and especially if you choose that level of fear, then eventually your amygdala, that part of your brain that tells you to worry about things that could cause you danger, your amygdala gets bored with it, and that level of anxiety drops off a cliff if you wait long enough. And so, and that's why ERP has been so effective for things that are fear triggers, especially when it's titrated properly and done humanely. So I'm still a big fan of the ERP model. Mm-hmm. Disgust, on the other hand, I'll try not to get too deeply into neurobiology here, but it's processed in a very different part of your brain. In the early 2000s, they did MRI studies that showed that when people react to disgust, it's processed by a part of your brain known as the insula. It's tied in with your gustatory reflexes over eating. Mm-hmm. And its purpose is to prevent you from being poisoned by things. And so as a result, when you encounter a disgust trigger, what happens is that goes into your long-term memory. And those triggers, for the sake of survival, don't change very easily. And there is, in many cases, no extinction burst for disgust. There are other cognitive strategies that help, but not that one. So what we discovered, you look at contamination OCD is one of the bigger themes of OCD that people treat. And as we all know, ERP does have a noticeable failure rate among certain communities of people. We talk about it having a 60% effectiveness rate. The studies vary, of course. Abramowitz mentioned 50%. When you count in things like dropout, relapse, treatment failure, and things like that. When people do it and it works, it's highly effective. But there is a fraternity of people for whom it doesn't work. And that's where new ideas like these, and some of the newer cognitive approaches are reaching to that unlucky 40%, or whatever that number is.
Right. So kind of the part of the brain, to just kind of take a step back, that part of the brain, you said that the insula is kind of managing that disgust. Is that where that one trial learning takes place? You eat something. Yeah, go ahead.
That's correct. Now, think about your own experiences. So if you were listening to Kevin and me, if you ate something and got really sick from it 20 years ago, I'll bet you anything you still avoid it today.
I have not had a Thai iced tea in probably 13 years because of one bad experience. And I used to love it before that.
And that means you're a really smart guy whose survival instincts are working A-OK.
One of those things is true, but go on.
Back when I was your neighbor in Orange County, and now I'm almost 70 now, so back in the 80s when I lived in Orange County, I was in my 20s or 30s, I had artichokes. They were delicious. I had a big plate of them and then spent the rest of the night throwing up. I can't even look at an artichoke nowadays.
Fair enough. Right. And that part of our brain, as much as we can hate on it, as much as someone experiencing disgust might be so angry at that part of their brain, it's really adaptive. I mean, think about those, back in the day, if you were to eat something that was bad for you and you had a tremendous reaction to it, your brain would say, hey, let's not do that again. And it holds on to that, because if you kept eating it, one, it might kill you, which is bad.
That's exactly correct. I believe that almost all OCD is a survival instinct that is finely tuned in really intelligent people. And I think that's especially so in the case of disgust. So I'll press forward a little bit about what this means clinically. Okay. And I think it really means that you have to take a step back and look at how we overcome fear, how people who don't have OCD overcome fear, and how people who have disgust overcome disgust, because they're very different things. So think of something I mentioned in the article. Suppose you are learning to ride a bicycle for the first time. It's scary when you first take your feet off the ground and try to go forward in the bike. And, unless you're a fan of skin knees, you're going to go carefully and you're going to habituate to it. But then at some point, you have that extinction burst. You cross over. Now you're able to ride the bike, and you have that skill forever. And that's why we have the term, it's like riding a bike. Now let's look at disgust. Let's say you look at a new mother who's having to deal with a flood of poop for the first time, or a sanitation worker who has to handle yucky garbage every day, or a paramedic who has to tend to dead bodies. My neighbor in Orange County was a paramedic,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, he was the fire chief of one of the cities in LA, and he said, "I've seen so many dead bodies in so many different places. I'm used to it." So the thing is that that mother doesn't stick her hands in a pail of dirty diapers to get used to poop.
For funsies.
She keeps changing her baby, and does it often enough that becomes less scary and routine, and the triggers soften over time. Paramedics don't hang out with dead bodies all day to get used to them. They do their job. And that's how we get over disgust, is we learn to live with it rather than habituate it or overcome it. Because, again, that's such a strong survival instinct. And that is the key to how I've discovered, and we've discovered, that we treat it clinically, which is now everyone who's already an OCD therapist and is a big fan of ERP, take a deep breath and gasp here with me. It involves using judicious use of safety behaviors.
Did it work? Did it do it?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
It involves judicious use of safety behaviors to listen carefully, make yourself comfortable enough to get a lot of practice in the situations you're avoiding because of the disgust trigger, which means that if you get enough practice in, those triggers soften over a very long period of time, and you get used to, listen carefully, the situation, not the trigger.
Yeah, and I want to jump in there. I think that is the dramatic shift in this. Is the focus of what you're working kind of your target of treatment. I think the tradition. I love the examples you gave. Right, they're very visceral. Right. By the way, the phrase "flood of poop" is I think if nobody is getting that mental image, just work at it. Just really get this idea, this flood of poop. I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids. There's a flood of poop, and it's gross. There's no ungrossing that, right? But this idea of, like, you're right, to get used to the traditional ERP method. All right, we're going to get used to the poop. We're going to put our hands on the poop. We're going to sit there. We're going to look at our hands with the poop and just tolerate that feeling, observe where it's at, and just ride that out. If it's a dead body, we're just going to go hang out by some dead bodies because we have them around, and we're just going to hang out with them until we get used to them. But there may be no getting used to it.
In my case, personally, that approach, which, again, the ERP therapists I first saw were good therapists. They were practicing how they were trained. I'm not faulting them. But that approach traumatized me and has traumatized other people. And a great example in public is Scott Stossel, who's the editor of Atlantic Magazine. If you Google him, he wrote a book called My Age of Anxiety. He also wrote an article in Atlantic Magazine. He has emetophobia, and people and his CBT therapist had him do an emetophobia exposure that involved actually throwing up, taking syrup of ipecac with a nerve there. Oh. It went horribly sideways. It traumatized him. It traumatized his therapist. It traumatized the nurse. It was a long road back from that exposure.
Okay, and so it's a bold move for emetophobia therapy.
Yeah, exactly. But and this therapist kept saying, "No, there's literature support for this. You have to do this," and so forth. So, so glad you share my skepticism about. But the point I was going to make is that my problem with disgust triggers, especially when I had multiple life issues going on, with health and retirement and things like that. All those exposures did was close me in and cross-contaminate everything in my life. So if somebody, and it's in the article I mentioned how trying to do straight-on ERP with disgust is like trying to smear dog poop on everything you own, trying to get used to it, and then discovering that you can't.
Right. And pretending like it's okay.
Exactly. So, my advice, if anyone comes to me and says, "Oh, you should do more exposure," and just keep doing it until the disgust triggers are over, which there is an argument for some flavor of that. We can talk about that later. But
I'd love to hear maybe a defining line or a differentiation between when just hit ERP harder versus more of a disgust approach. But I'll put a note down for that.
Definitely not hit ERP harder. But if you're going to do lots of exposure, you have to make it comfortable to do that lots of exposure, which means you have to titrate it carefully, and you have to make it palatable to do it often. I'll I'll talk about it as a side issue, because my focus is really on people functioning better, because disgust fears limit your functioning. That's the key. Here's a quick example of what I propose in the article.
Yeah.
Let's say that somebody's sprayed insecticide all over your kitchen, and now you can't go in the kitchen. You're just overwhelmed by that insecticide. The big thing I had to overcome in my own recovery was I had a motorhome that did in fact get flooded with insecticide, and I couldn't go in it for a very long time. And learning to use safety behaviors, wearing ratty clothes, wearing gloves, let me go into the RV and do what I had to do to winterize it, to store it, eventually to get it fixed. Now, when would I ever be comfortable sleeping in that RV with all that insecticide? Never. However, that's like, you've had 2 kids, Kevin. When will you sit down on a chair that has visible poop on it? Probably never.
Alternatively, I would say maybe this weekend. I don't know. But yes, exactly. I hear what you're saying. Willfully doing it, it would be rare.
Exactly. And as in researching this, I have good friends who are practicing veterinarians, which is another very poop-intensive profession, and they agreed with everything I was saying in terms of their own revulsion to poop versus their ability to do their job and habituating to that over time as well. But the point I want to make is, would this be a good time to hit the issue between good accommodations and bad accommodations? Because I bet that's what a lot of your listeners are holding their breath about.
Let's jump into that. I think now would be a decent time.
Sounds good. So there's actually some literature support for this. It's not something I just made up. A group with John Abramowitz did a paper a few years ago on it, where he concluded that judicious use of safety behavior was no better and no worse than ERP. Stanley Rockman in Canada, did a more recent paper, Adam Radomski's group, who was, I think, the principals at it, which used safety behaviors judiciously and showed that actually had very good outcomes for people. So a good safety behavior is something that enables practice with an avoided situation. You could think of it like a crutch. If I do not have a leg injury, and I use crutches all the time, my leg's going to atrophy. But on the other hand, if I broke my leg and I try to walk without a crutch, I'm either going to be in tremendous pain or I'm going to injure myself. And the crutch enables me to walk long enough that I can eventually put down the crutch and walk without it. So good accommodations for disgust should be judicious, should enable more practice, should gradually be pulled away as you get more used to the situation that you're facing the trigger in. And they should be an enabling technology, not an avoidance technology. So if you're simply choosing an accommodation to put further barriers between you and the trigger, that's a bad accommodation, in my view.
And I think if we're going to, get nitpicky with words, I think some people might get hung up on the word enabling, right? You said it's an enabling accommodation. It's, I think we hear enabling in the context of alcohol or drug use, right? So we are enablers to this, right? It's that, but I think in this one, I think what I'm hearing when you say enabling, it is encouraging towards functioning, towards continued functioning within their life so that they can keep moving forward, keep holding their responsibilities, their relationships, et cetera, to the point where they can start to pull back on the unnecessary and unhelpful accommodations. I mean, for example, with that broken leg, that cast is not then going to be on your leg forever.
Right, exactly.
But it is there for the period of time until it is healed enough to then be taken off for physical therapy for now having to test that healed bone.
That's a perfect analogy, Kevin. In my case with the motorhome that I was avoiding, as I use safety behaviors, I found myself increasingly getting in the RV, driving it, getting it repaired. I eventually took it to Philadelphia and I had it consigned to be sold. And then I found over time, it really got a lot easier to do that. And I remember when I was driving it to Philadelphia, at one point, I ended up coming in contact with things I normally wouldn't contact. And I was like, okay, fine. Because I had so much practice. And that's where good accommodations soften triggers enough that you can confront things that habituate over a very long period of time. That's really the key. Is it's playing against your insula instead of your amygdala. That's the key to this clinical approach. One other thing I'll say, I love Abramowitz's paper because it was very detailed and had a big sample size. He looked at people who were afraid of spiders and gave them a choice of certain accommodations, like you could wear gloves or boots or something like that. What I really liked about Radomski's group was that it was a very complete safety behavior. In other words, it was you were allowed to wash or clean yourself off or have wipes or something like that if you had a contamination fear. So I really liked the results that that Radomski's group got with his literature. I'm open to any questions you might have on how we differentiate good and bad safety behaviors.
Yeah, that was kind of going through my mind as you were talking about this. It's like, all right, so let's say somebody's listening to this. Maybe it's a family member of someone struggling with disgust-based obsessions, and their life has become very, very small as a result, right?
Exactly.
But yeah, they have read, things, listened to podcasts, watched videos, gone to conferences, and they've heard accommodations bad, exposure good. All right.
Right. Exactly.
And they want to do the best for their person. Now, how do we start to decide what level of accommodation is going to be appropriate? When are we in a helpful stance towards this person versus when are we and maybe this is a language that kind of goes against this approach. When are we instead fighting for the obsession and we're now in the camp of OCD?
Absolutely. So it depends on the goal. And in the case of family accommodation, I will bet you anything, the goal isn't for their loved one to get used to a trigger. I'm guessing that the goal is for the family to be functioning better. And that should be what the approach was. Long before I ever got up close and personal with my own disgust and sort of conceptualized this approach with my therapist, I used a similar strategy with a lot of my other clients. People with scrupulosity, for example, where the thought of doing exposure to a blasphemous thought, possibly going to hell, was overwhelming for somebody. But that person was driving their family nuts, seeking constant reassurance. And so what we would do is we would co-create with the sufferer and the family how many fewer times they would reassure themselves this week compared to last week. So we'd focus on the response prevention part of it, and that worked beautifully. And moreover, to put a finer point on it, I'd give the sufferer a get-out-of-jail-free card where if they had a really bad night, they could compulse away. And so these outs, these accommodations had a phenomenal response rate from clients I worked with. And so, long before disgust was ever on my radar, aside from just being something I tolerated, my own clinical experience with accommodations really was game-changing for my clients and for me as a clinician.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I've practiced with clients as well. You bring up the issue of scrupulosity. If we were to just simply say, stop doing compulsions, we wouldn't see people very long, and they would realize that just simply the stop it approach, as much as, we love that video. I'm sure you've seen the stop it video.
I have. Oh, yeah. I love it.
Who hasn't? But it just simply doesn't work. And that's kind of what people hear. So what we are going to say, all right, let's shift over to showering. All right, so you're taking a 2-hour shower.
Yeah.
All right. If you take an hour and a half shower, is that still longer than the average person? Yes, but that's a half an hour of difference, and that's a world of difference in slowly bringing back that accommodation, right? So we are permitting, in a sense, an hour and a half long shower.
Absolutely correct. And you think about that, if you go from showering, I've seen clients who showered 8 hours a day, for example. When you go from that to 2 hours a day, do you have OCD? Oh, yes, you do. But now you can have a job or relationship. Your life has changed in a huge way. That's what happened with me. For example, I just got back from Europe a few months ago. I discovered I like being in Europe a whole bunch more than I like being stuck in my bedroom. So,
right, being in Europe, you still will likely have obsessions and anxieties and worries and the urge towards compulsive behavior and maybe even the giving into compulsive behavior. But you're a lot more likely to be happy in Europe than you are sitting in your room again.
That's exactly correct. And I loved being in Europe. So so to put a finer point on this, if you're in terms of what's good or bad in terms of exposure and accommodations, I think it all circles around what's working or not working for the clients. If ERP is a good model, it should work in small doses. For example, if you take a hoop shot, low-level exposure, it should eventually habituate, no matter how much ACT or inhibitory learning or whatever you throw at it. It should work. And unfortunately, and this is where a lot of my advocacy comes in nowadays, as I've connected with other clinicians with lived experience who've had similar experiences to mine, which is, unfortunately, sometimes our profession's messaging has led to a reality behind closed doors in therapy where if ERP or evidence-based therapy in general isn't working for somebody, it's presumed to be our fault. We're not brave enough. We're not Zen enough. We're a treatment failure. We need to come back when we're ready.
It's the fault of the client, the
individual. Fault of the client.
Right.
And I think, we should never weaponize the term evidence-based therapy. I follow the literature. As you know, I'm an engineer by training, and I used to actually publish refereed research in that field. And actual research on OCD and every other field is nuanced and incomplete. We say ERP is evidence-based. It certainly is, certainly my go-to for clients. But on the other hand, I've looked at so many papers where they look at 40, sufferers that do ERP and 40 sufferers who read Golf Digest. ERP wins, but, their Yale Brown scores have reduced by 6 points, and 30% of them didn't respond. So, their suffering matters too. And so I honestly think that we as a profession have to delight in new ideas and emerging ideas. I think a competent OCD therapist has to have multiple tools in their toolkit. Listen carefully when your favorite approach doesn't work for the client in front of you, and we have to listen to the client in front of us.
Right. It's so tricky. And I think, I've been in that place too. I feel like I'm, periodically getting that with my own clients now of, we're going to do ERP because it works. And then you start bashing your head against the wall going, why this isn't moving forward quote, as it should.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So it's thinking about what are the different ways. I mean, again, a hammer is great, but when you've got a screw, a hammer is not going to be as effective. Right.
Absolutely. And clinicians who don't have lived experience with OCD have to be particularly careful about this because, the whole movement that you're seeing towards multiple approaches, new ideas, other cognitive approaches for you, so much of that is being driven by clinicians with lived experience who have seen how treating one treatment approach as a religion rather than as your best tool has affected them and their clients. And that's why you're seeing the kind of advocacy that you're seeing nowadays, which has been very healthy for the field. Right. And
yes, and it can be tough. I mean, when people get, hear about a new treatment method, they get really excited behind it. And, can it be used as an integrated approach of saying these are the things that work. This is a integrated toolbox of effective tools that work, instead of saying this is the one, throw out all the other ones because they don't work. Anyways, this is we yammered on about that. We don't need to hammer that further.
Exactly.
Every pun intended, perhaps.
I'm very aligned with that view. In other words, I think the ideal view is that we should delight in each other's ideas, old and new. We should delight in each other's companies, people who are trying to heal this disorder. And I personally view every approach as a tool, not the one new thing that's better than all the other things out there. And I think that's the only healthy, rational way to approach being a clinician in a field that's evolving as much as OCD is still evolving.
Absolutely. So if we were to, let's kind of let's hone in on a potential situation, if we could.
Sure.
Right. So let's think about a potential person who may be struggling with something that's disgust-based, and what might be a way to start approaching this case as with a disgust-based OCD treatment model, where there are appropriate and reasonable accommodations that are going to be taking place, and then how that's eventually starting to pull back? I mean, I think let's go with someone who, I mean, we can go with an emetophobia example if you'd like, or we can,
Sure.
Okay. I mean, so go ahead.
I have some other thoughts. So I had a fascinating conversation a week or so ago with another clinician who messaged me about how to use disgust assessment scales. There's two main ones out there. There's the disgust scale, which that looks at things like, how do you react to the thought of eating monkey meat or putting ketchup on your ice cream? And it gives you a quantitative score as to how.
I'm very interested in one and not in the other.
Right, exactly.
But go on. I will not tell which one.
And the one I like better, actually, and this is from Bumni Olatunji at Vanderbilt, who's really the king of disgust research. He and Dean McKay at Fordham and a bunch of other people have really changed the game in terms of showing the correlation between disgust and contamination OCD and looking at it clinically. They freely admit we're just looking at the clinical aspects of that in terms of how to treat it, but they have done such groundbreaking work. So anyway, but I digress. So she wanted to know, how should she use these scales as an assessment tool? And my response was that I often don't. And the reason is because disgust triggers in OCD are often very specific to the individual. As an example, think of a sexual abuse survivor who finds herself disgusted with her body or other people's bodies, for example, and it's getting in the way of intimacy and relationships and things like that. She may be fine with people putting ketchup on their ice cream. She may score very low on a disgust assessment. I like the DPSS from Dr. Olatunji because he measures your disgust propensity and sensitivity. In other words, how likely you are to be disgusted and how badly it affects you. So his doesn't talk about ice cream and ketchup. He talks about how you feel when you are disgusted, for example. So that's a good measure. But in either case, I'm going to start the assessment with their functioning level, their self-report, and their Yale-Brown score. How bad is the OCD for their life, for example? And then we work from there. So first I'd want to assess whether this really is disgust versus fear. I'll ask a lot of questions about, are you worried you're going to get sick or hurt other people? In that case, that's fear, and that might follow more of an ERP track, for example.
Right.
And then, but if they say, no, I just feel gross and I worry that I'm never going to feel clean enough again, then that kind of smells like disgust to me.
Right. And I kind of describe those as like, one has a story, one just has a feeling. It's one is this like, this will happen and this will happen. And along the way, I might feel disgusted or I might feel anxious, and then it leads to this something. But there's a story, whereas there is disgust, I just feel bad. I feel gross.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so then, of course, I'll do psychoeducation with the client. I'll be very transparent about the ways we can approach this clinically in terms of what's out there. I'm not averse to trying a little ERP first and seeing where it goes if the client buys into it. So I often use what I call the blood test analogy. I'll ask the client if they're afraid to have their blood drawn. Most people will say no. And I'll then explain that I'm not afraid of that either. And if I have to have my blood drawn, I'm not going to lay awake at night about it the night before. I'm not going to certainly not show up. But the way I feel just before they jab the needle in, let's call that a 5 out of 100. That's where I want them to practice. I want them to take a real hoop shot exposure and see if they can sit with those feelings, be fully present with it, and get that sucker down to 0. And if they can, then ERP is still a trajectory for them. But if the thought of even doing a small exposure feels overwhelming, if they're concerned about cross-contamination, or if it's just complicated or scary for them, then I'm going to look at how do you wish you were functioning better, and what could we do to enable you getting more practice doing that function. And so that's kind of my decision tree when I assess somebody.
Okay. So let's say in this, you've now decided this person is, less on the, feared story sort of track, right? Less of anxiety and says, all right, this is more of, it's just disgust, right?
Exactly.
So the example of giving blood, how is that more of like, because giving blood is painful. I don't know who you're going to talk to that's going to convince you that you can habituate to a giant metal thing being stuck into your arm is going to feel okay. I try to give blood a lot, as much as I can. And, I'm not afraid of needles, but then right before, I kind of tense up and they go, are you afraid of needles? I go, no, it's just, it's a giant metal stick being put into my arm. It hurts.
Exactly
right?
Correct.
All right. Well, is that indicative of the disgust for someone who may be struggling with this, as opposed to, it's not like I'm going to give blood and they're going to take all my blood, or I'm going to get hepatitis because of this needle. It's just, it just hurts.
You framed that beautifully, actually. I always came at it from a slightly different perspective, which I used as a metaphor for a level of discomfort that I wanted them to not practice above. Because I always like starting low and slow and seeing if something works before we have them jump off the bridge, so to speak.
Sure.
And, by the way, I use ERP as a metaphor because that's, usually my first go-to with clients. But, we've recently trained on inference therapy, for example, and I think the same is going to be true with the third wave approaches. The ICBT doesn't consider itself a third wave approach, but if I'm going to try a different approach, ICBT I can conceive as being very useful for the what ifs that surround a disgust fear. What if something might have been contaminated? Am I using my logic here and so forth? So,
right, kind of indulging the possibilities component of that second module.
Exactly. So I'm very excited about strategies like that too. Right. But even in that case, I'm really going to be focused on what works and does it work? And I'm going to be more concerned with what are we doing practically to help somebody function better and get more innings functioning better versus fidelity to a model.
Right. And I think that's a tremendous approach. So how do we get this person? This leads into the age-old argument for therapists of, do we do those really sexy, fun, TV-worthy, big exposures, or do we do things that are leading them more towards functioning within their life? There's roles taken for both, but you're definitely along the lines of function. How do we get this person to just live their life, go to work, do their daily tasks, be a functional human being within the context of their life? And within that, then, so it sounds like for this person, this imagined person, we've decided, all right, they've got more of they're more on the disgust side of things. So it's just this feeling. So now we want to think about how is it that we're going to look at then what their in a sense, their compulsions first. What are the ways that what are the things that they feel that they need to do in order to effectively live their life or to functionally live their life? And we're saying in accommodation to the mastery model that you're kind of championing, we're going to start with, all right, let's do those so that you can live your life.
I love the way you've worded that. That's precisely how I conceptualize, and that's precisely how I expose it to the client as well. Is what would be a big fat benefit for you compared to where you're at now, and what steps could we take to get there? And I want to pick up on something you also said. You talked about the TV-worthy exposures. I'm not opposed to them when a client is on board with that idea. Sometimes, signature brave exposure events have been life-changing for people. But that's not something I go to first.
Right.
That's just my philosophy because of my clinical experience, because I'm the least brave person in the world myself. But on the other hand, in my case, just to do a little self-disclosure here, I first got interested in cognitive behavioral therapy. I became a therapist in my 50s, but when I was in my 20s, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth in the 1970s, I suffered from severe agoraphobia and lived a very limited life for many years. And CBT let me out of my cage and changed my life. I went on to become a software executive and log 500,000 air miles. And I'm very thankful for what CBT did for me back then. But what turned the corner for me was a brave, TV-worthy exposure. My family had moved to Arizona, which could have been the moon for me living in upstate New York. And so I did CBT early 70s, bark alarms and Valium type CBT, where I would drive down an unfamiliar road a quarter of a mile at a time. And after 3 weeks, I went 3/4 of a mile. Okay, big whoop. When I could go 2 miles, suddenly I could go 5 miles. And then the next week I'd go 70 miles away to the nearest major city. And then immediately afterwards, I got on an airplane and went to Arizona and had a great time. And that cured me. And to this day, I don't have a second thought about hopping in the car and going to Toronto or stepping on a plane somewhere.
That's fantastic.
And I've seen the same magic happen with my clients, but the differentiator there is They choose that. It's not me in expert mode saying you should or you have to do that. So that's just my personal values.
And they've got the willingness to do it. It sounds like they've got the drive. They've got the want to do it.
Yep.
I mean, it's a whole separate conversation of like, how do you apply this then with a client who's just not wanting to do it, not ready to do it? But let's maybe the focus on that person who's ready to go. I mean, where's that line then? Like, where's that line for you of like that big accommodation scale, right? The accommodations of, all right, these are the compulsions. We're going to call them compulsions. These are things that you need to do to get back to your life. Do we draw the line just to what the individual is doing, or what is the role that family has in that? Because I'm sure you've had these clients too. The client has asked the family. Go ahead.
Let's circle back to that. There's a big fundamental question that you ask in this case, which is, are you moving towards or away? So let's take the person who's avoiding their kitchen because of the insecticide.
Yeah.
If they're going to get their meals from Uber Eats, that's a bad accommodation. They're moving away from being in that kitchen. If they're wearing gloves so they can be back in their kitchen preparing food, live it up, knock yourself out and be in that kitchen a lot.
But you got to be in that kitchen.
Does that make sense? To be in that kitchen. So are you moving towards better functioning or away from better functioning? That's the question. And then there's always the gravity of the accommodation. So you talk about family accommodation.
Yes.
Often people's OCD involves other people. You want to take steps towards making life better for the family and making life better for you. So that's another example. Take the sexual abuse survivor, for example. I would want to see them, if they grieve the loss of intimacy and companionship in their life, I'd want their safety behaviors to take steps towards that. So maybe they chat with people on a dating site and say no, until they're ready to take another step, for example. But they do lots of practice on that. That's my differentiator, is you're moving towards, and what's the gravity of the accommodation.
And I think that's the frame. The frame of, are we moving towards or against, I think is a beautiful and very simple way to view it. Is this thing going? I mean, it's kind of the ACT kind of target model. Are we moving towards our target, or is this moving away? That idea then of oh man, I completely lost it. Useless. My brain is useless today. So all right. With those family accommodations, are they? Is it something where? Is it fair or unfair to ask family members to participate in this? And in what way do we ask family members to join for, or to, what am I trying to say, to accommodate through some of these behaviors, or do we have that distinction? Family members are going to be family members. They're going to be themselves, and they don't have to. Of course. They don't have to participate. It's kind of like that. OCD holds the family hostage.
Right, absolutely.
To itself, right?
Absolutely. And that is something that is evolving still. And that's a very important evolution, and something I'm very interested in as a family therapist. My answer to that is that ideally the family and the sufferer co-create weekly goals that they move towards each week. And I'm more than happy to let them choose the steps, and within limits, let them choose the accommodations that allow that next step to take place. Again, based on whether they're moving towards or moving away. And if an accommodation is going to enable, open up a lot of space for things that a family's been held hostage for. So, for example, again, I'll use a contamination metaphor. Okay. Let's say instead of making mom prepare all your meals, you wear gloves and you make the meals. Then wear the friggin' gloves and make a lot of meals and see where you're at in a month.
And that's where my brain suddenly jumped back on board just a moment ago. It was the reps.
It's the reps. You got it. It's the reps. Good accommodation should enable lots of reps with desired behaviors. Right,
and I think that's ultimately the key with with ERP is you don't just do it that one time. It's you got to do it. You got to do it. We only get good at something by doing it over and over and over again. Right?
And in my humble opinion, remember, I'm just one yock in the middle of upstate New York, and what I'm talking about with Disgust is not research-based at this point. But in my humble opinion, this is where we split off to the left from ERP, because the role of ERP is to make yourself comfortable and habituate. But with a trigger that does not habituate, and a situation that may be harder to habituate to, your job is to make yourself, listen carefully, comfortable and do a lot of practice. That's what's worked for me. That's what's worked for clients.
Right. When
Disgust is the trigger.
Right. And again, so it's again that moving towards are we doing things that are leading? So those accommodations, are the accommodations helping the person avoid a situation? If that's the case, that's not the direction we're moving in.
Correct.
But if it's something that you're doing that you can then practice it, it's training wheels. How do you put the training wheels on the bike so that you can get back to riding that bike? You can try to put someone on a bike without training wheels and just shove them and hope for the best, and it's going to be hilarious, but not very helpful. But if you put the training wheels on, they're going to kind of get going. I'm thinking about my daughter who's just learning how to ride a bike. It would be
good for her.
It would be moderately. It would be mean, but kind of all right. Anyways, someone else's child, that would be hilarious. Mine, not so much. But yeah, those training wheels is going to get them going so that they can go. Oh, I kind of got the mechanics. I know how this works, and then I'm ready to pop those off, and then give it a try, and maybe probably fall.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reps. How does someone get the reps?
And also, so you've touched on a couple important themes with that whole metaphor about the training wheels. One is moving towards, the other is getting lots of reps in, and then a third one is, as you put it earlier, client willingness. That's a core principle of ACT. I think ACT has added a lot of value to ERP because of that. And if there's one value that I've always had as a clinician, it's that I've always been client-driven. So, in other words, we co-create a treatment plan with the client. So, for example, again, using my metaphor of a sexual abuse survivor, I've had female clients say, I'm a sexual abuse survivor. I don't want some male therapist like you hanging me over every week and asking how much exposure I've done. So my response to that is to go full Burger King and say, okay, have it your way. You tell me how you're functioning every week.
Yeah.
And I've had good outcomes using that flexible approach. So.
Right. I mean, what I think one of the things that I'm really that's a big draw for this approach. It is very, it's not to get too hung up on the verbiage, but it's very client centered. It is looking at what the client's sensitivity will allow them to do, and then therefore what they're willing to do. So it's meeting them. In a sense, it's meeting them halfway rather than saying you're going to accommodate or you're going to step into this framework. We're going to meet you halfway, and hopefully that will kind of gain their buy-in, gain their willingness to start participating in that process. I know we've talked about, I'm having flashbacks to our earlier conversation about this approach, this accommodation isn't a buy-in tactic, right?
Exactly. It's correct. If it serves as one, that's great, but its real objective is to be an enabling strategy for functioning better.
Right.
And to get used to functioning better, and eventually for those triggers that stay in the way of functioning better to soften over a long period of time.
Right. In what ways does this approach differ from maybe inhibitory learning? I know we've been hearing a lot about that at conferences and things like that. In what way is it similar? In what ways would you say it's different?
That's a good question. I'm not a big expert on inhibitory learning because I haven't really used it myself a lot in practice. So I'll give you, sort of a rookie appraisal of that question. The idea that you vary levels of exposure, for example, and that your approach isn't necessarily to habituate, but instead it's to for your brain to learn over time by disconfirming expectations. That shares a lot in common with what I recommend for Disgust, which is putting yourself in a situation. I think, again, this is my lack of expertise on inhibitory learning. I think a lot depends what syllable you put it on. if you're cynical about it, you can look at that protocol as saying, oh, so you're not habituating? Well, fine, just keep suffering anyway. Maybe you'll learn. I don't think that that's the intention that Michelle Krasky had with it. So I'm sure. But on the other hand, the idea that, you put yourselves in situations, you live life, and, you don't necessarily follow a hierarchy, and that, sometimes the heavens opened up and you look at things from a different perspective. All fears are ultimately lost because we cognitively perceive them differently. So I see all of them, without exception, whether you're habituating to it, whether you're using inference therapy to change your logical process to see how you're thinking about it, whether you're using inhibitory learning to disconfirm your expectations about it. At the end of the day, at some point, you've made a cognitive change where something clicks.
Right.
And it's not as scary as it used to be.
Right. And within that, I think that's where the reps come back in. We do that not through... I hear the ICBT people yelling at me already. We don't change our thoughts and then we're ready to go do it. We have to step in. We have to get our butt on the bike and start practicing to the point where our brain goes, oh, I can do this. But I mean, it takes that first step of saying, I think I can do this. And the convincing yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting. I kind of agree with you, and I'll tell you what I mean by kind of agree with you. That was always ICBT's premise, and also Michael Greenberg's premise, was that if you're not ruminating, or if you are, stepping outside of the OCD bubble and trusting your senses and reality, then exposure becomes easy. Then you're just behaviorally testing what you used to avoid. And sometimes that nexus happens. And that's, of course, for a lot of, when ICBT works, that is the mechanism by which it works. You suddenly don't have to worry that you're going to harm your kid, or you don't have to worry that every time you drive over a bump, you've run over somebody or whatever. But when it doesn't work, there is some overlap with behaviorism here. But I'll give you another example, which is another point I wanted to bring up about this Disgust protocol, which is, I joke that it solves half our problem, which is, it's a great strategy for getting used to situations that involve a trigger. The great unanswered problem is still, can one ever get used to a disgust trigger? Can we ever make poop not disgusting? Can we ever make things that have imprinted in our insula as disgusting? Can we reconceptualize those things? There's been some interesting research on strategies like counter conditioning, for example. Jacob Fink-Lamott's group in Germany did a study where they tried a short counter conditioning example with OCD sufferers with contamination and disgust OCD, and it was a very short intervention. It reduced their disgust levels from 4.5 out of 5 to 4 out of 5, so big whoop. But it's an interesting trajectory. I personally had an interesting experience with counter conditioning that I found fascinating. During the COVID pandemic, I was doing some COVID testing, and like a lot of us were, and I spilled that fluid that you put the nasal swab in all over my hands. And then I looked at the package insert. It mentioned the chemical they use, and I looked it up, and they said it's like one of the deadliest poisons known to mankind. It's more poisonous than cyanide. Now, for somebody like me with Disgust OCD, the thought of having even one molecule of that on my hands was overwhelming. So, an average person would look at the concentration of it and realize that the concentration is so low that it's not going to hurt you. But for me, different matrix. So here's what happened that night. It was fascinating. So I read an article that said it's deadlier than cyanide. And I thought, cyanide? I eat peaches. I enjoy them. Peaches contain a little bit of cyanide, and I enjoy them. It's part of what makes peaches taste tart. So instead of having a mental image of this fluid as something that was toxic and bitter and so forth, I thought about it that it's like peaches. That was my mental image, and I felt much better about it. So I think counter conditioning, still a lot of research. The results are very modest, but so there's still work to be done in that area. Dean McKay did a workshop recently on disgust. He's the dean, no pun intended, of it, along with Dr. Olatunji. And he acknowledged that he has a concern with counter conditioning that it's hard to find a good stimulus that will overwhelm the bad stimulus of a disgust trigger. But that's an active area of research. He mentioned some other avenues that people are pursuing, strategies for exposure, for example, where, so stay tuned. There may be actually some hope for that piece of it too, but we're still very early on that path.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to bring up here is that, in the conversation of how to treat someone with a disgust-based obsession, the avenues of treatment are shifting and changing, and the knowledge base is growing, and the approaches are going to get fine-tuned over time. But so it's not to say, as we discussed, your disgust-based OCD treatment protocol, this may or may not be the thing that we're doing in 40 years. But
I totally agree.
This is one perhaps better step than what we've been doing, and that's why we're having these conversations and trying to get the information out. Try it, see what works, get rid of the stuff that doesn't, and do more of the stuff that does. So that's, I think that's a good point to bring up.
I could not agree with you more on that, Kevin. I'll make an analogy to my old technical career. I was in the computer graphics field, and
which never changes. It is stable as can be. But go ahead.
Oh, right, exactly. So if you've ever had a CAT scan, one of my few claims to fame in the computer graphics field is I published the first refereed paper on how to optimize CAT scans. A CAT scan is like a million little boxes, and you go knock on the door of each box and say, "Hi, is your pancreas in there?" And I came up with a sorting strategy to let you search a much smaller neighborhood to find that pancreas and be able to look at those images in real time. So what's my claim to fame now, 30 years later? I am the old, slow approach that everybody compares themselves to. So people nowadays say, we're 20 times faster than the Gallagher algorithm. And that's delightful because we have better CAT scans. And that's I think, the way we should all, especially, those people who are gurus, that's how we should all be approaching OCD treatment and its research.
Yeah. I brought this up when I was talking to Michael Greenberg. I have in my waiting or my lobby in here, I have a phrenology statue.
Oh, right. And where the shape of your head, bears on your psychology.
Exactly. Where, it's while, debunked as pseudoscience in its finest, in the highest order. But,
exactly.
At the time, it was considered something. And we think it's bonkers now. So what is the thing that we're doing now that we're going to consider bonkers in time? So we're going to shift and change, and we're going to learn. But, it's also what represents therapy more than a phrenology statue.
That's right, exactly. And it's interesting how research has evolved in psychotherapy in general, because, the field's only a little over 100 years old and, a very small period of time in the scale of human history. But when I studied to be a marriage and family therapy, I found it fascinating. I was trained psychodynamically. And you look at the early theorists in marriage and family therapy and in psychotherapy in general, what they did is they had an approach that worked maybe a third of the time. Remember that no therapy also works a third of the time. They would cherry pick 2 or 3 cases that worked, write a book about it, go on a lecture tour, and that would be their approach. And we've now evolved to be a lot more science-based. And I think the next frontier is more people who have lived experience, especially as clinicians, have more of a role in the research agenda. I look at the Nothing About Us Without Us movement, neurodiversity, for example, and I look at the advocacy of people with lived experience with OCD who've been driving the ICBT movement, for example. I think that's more of a trend that we need to be seeing more of in the future, and I think that's going to be very healthy for the field. And my advice to everybody, whether you're a proponent of current evidence or whether you're a proponent of new approaches, is delight in the company of everybody who's trying to, heal people in this field, and be open to new ideas. Don't be gatekeepers of those ideas. Share your misgivings about what is and isn't as proven as what you like the best. But always, listen to the voices of people who've been there before, and especially listen to the client who's in front of you. Right. And be willing to try things if what you like doing most isn't working.
Right. I don't think it could be said any better than that. I think is there I know we've been talking for quite some time. Is there anything else that you'd want to add, or because I think we can kind of move towards the wrapping up. But is there anything else that you want to add to kind of maybe give listeners, either on the client side, the supporter side, or the therapist side, a clearer idea?
I think just one last thing I'd like to say, and Kevin, I want to say I have so enjoyed this conversation. This has been, we've covered so much good ground here, and this has been so much fun holding forth with you about it. I'm a big fan of your podcast, for a long time anyway. Well, but I do want to have a word to the sufferers out there, which is if I want to get a pair of sunglasses, the best, even if somebody has a sunglasses shop that is devoted to sunglasses, I may not like their sunglasses. And so if you're a sufferer, and I think it's really important that, number one, you advocate for yourself. If what Dr. Wonderful is doing with you isn't working for you, have a conversation about that. Don't just follow what the clinician says. Ask questions. I also encourage you to keep in touch with the literature. There's a lot of information out there on Google for free about what we're all talking about in the profession. So ask good questions, and you deserve to get well. We're just plumbers. You're the boss, and we work for you. and the other thing is the power of community. I'm such a fan of everybody in the OCD community, the IOCDF, the community of lived experience clinicians I'm with, podcasts like yours and Stuart Ralph's. You have done such a service by building a community of us sufferers where we talk to each other. And so that's my advice to any sufferer is be part of this community. Be a listener to it and also be a voice in it and advocate for yourself because, at the end of the day, we're all here to serve you.
Right. That's fantastic. Yeah, again, could not be said any better. So be an advocate. Speak up. If it feels like it's not quite working, it may be because it's not quite working, and you and your clinician are working as a team in a common direction. If it feels like it's this just push and pull, have a conversation about that. See if you can redirect that. So I think that's fantastic. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more written on this. Hopefully there's a lot more discussion on this. And we'll kind of see how we're going to progressively hone in on this and hopefully help some folks with, struggling with disgust-based obsessions. So is there a place where people can learn more about you or get more information?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, the Disgust protocol is in the latest IOCDF newsletter, and it's also on the blog at IOCDF.org as well. So if you want to check into that, that's where that lives. If you want to learn more about my cockeyed opinions about OCD treatment or a little more about me, my website is anxietycamp.com. I have a blog as well. I've also published several self-help books with my own cockeyed view of the world, and they're all on Amazon. If you want to look for them, and they're also listed on that website.
Well, I'll link to some of those things as well. So,
okay, sounds great.
Pretty soon you'll just have your own podcast where you can put your cockeyed views in the ears of someone else. That's what I've been doing for all these years.
I want to be Kevin Foss when I grow up. I don't think I'll ever get there. You're amazing, Kevin.
I want to be the person that you think I am one day too. So I think I'll get there. So, great. All right. Well, Rich Gallagher, thank you so much for joining me today and spending this time. So, I'll say this: if there are questions that people have about disgust-based obsessions and they send them in, would you be willing to jump back in and answer some of those questions?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Anytime. I'm always happy to respond to people as well.
Awesome, Rich. Well, we'll hopefully have you on again in the future. So thanks so much and have a great day.
Anytime. Thank you, Kevin. Take care.
All right, everybody, you made it through this episode. Thank you so much for sticking it out with us. I know we had a long chat, but I think it was a really interesting one. I think it was a really important one, and hopefully, if you're listening to it, you found some information that could be encouraging, motivational, or perhaps an open door to trying something different. And that's the whole purpose of this conversation. So if you have questions about this, again, if you have questions for Rich, send them over to fearcastpodcast.com, either through the website or go over to Instagram and message me over there. And if I, with any question, I'll reach out to him and see if he'd be willing to jump back on to kind of discuss your particular situation and to see if he can offer some stuff to think about. So, I suppose to that end, please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. I should also say that. Even when we're answering these questions, we're not offering psychotherapy precisely. We're offering ideas and information similar to as you'd find in a book. And, apply it, don't apply it, figure out what's going to work for you. But most importantly, talk about this information with your therapist or the person who's helping you through this. So, remember, it's not psychotherapy. It's not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you have any questions about or need any help in your recovery, go to fearcastpodcast.com, and there's going to be the Find Help link. Click on that. There's going to be some information for you there. So until next time, everybody, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.